This podcast provides a platform to discuss important questions and complex issues, challenge the status quo, and confront the boundaries of the establishment. I'm retired police chief Daniel Hahn. I went from being arrested at 16 to serving over 34 years in law enforcement. My goal is to keep you informed with news not being reported, voices not being heard, and the untold history of how we got here so that we can create a way forward. Our guest today is Sam Robinson, who retired as a captain from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Spent his career at San Quentin, a 26-year career. So I think we'll have a rich conversation today. So Sam, welcome to the show. Thank you. First question, what made you join the California Department of Corrections?
And so I'll tell you, I don't know anyone that's inspired. Their aspiration was to be a correctional officer, right? It's kind of something that you fall into. And that was definitely the case for me. I was a starving, struggling college student, working my way through college, had this aspiration to be an engineer. And I wasn't making much money, right? I was a security guard. And I had relatives who worked at San Quentin. At one while, I think there was like 26 of us who worked at the California Department of Corrections, and most of us were at San Quentin. And one of my uncles, who was one of the first to join the department, gave me an application. He gave me an application, said, fill this out. He said, you'll make a whole heck of a lot more money working for the California Department of Corrections than you are as a security guard. And I was like, no, dude, I have worked hard not to end up in prison.
I have an engineering degree.
I'm aspiring to get there.
I'm aspiring to get an engineering degree.
But there is no way I am going to, I'm not going to prison. And he said, hey, man, look, he said, you have dealt with these guys all your life. He said, you grew up in East Oakland. You know, I'm born in Oakland, born and raised in Oakland, grew up in East Oakland. He said, you grew up in East Oakland. He said, the same guys that you went to school with, the same guys you walk the streets with, the same guys you call friends are the people who are in San Quentin. He said, you're going to be all right. He said, just be yourself. And so I followed the process. I applied. And during the mid-'90s, you know, there was budgetary crisis and economy was bad. And so a couple days after I graduated with my engineering degree, I got a letter from the Department of Corrections saying, hey, we want to hire you. I was like, oh, yeah, I forgot I did that, right? and I accepted the offer, ended up being assigned to San Quentin State Prison. And I thought it was going to be something I would do short term, right? Mm-hmm. I thought it would be something that I would have in my back pocket, that I'd have these cool stories to be able to tell people at some point in time that, hey, I was a correctional officer at San Quentin. And lo and behold, you just never know what fits for you, what's actually right for you, right? Mm-hmm. You fall into these things, you know, you just take this step, and it was right for me. I know I fit there. And so what I thought would be a short-term, intermediate type of experience became a career for me. And I enjoyed every moment of my existence there.
And I think, I was surprised, but I think most people would be surprised that here's a guy with a degree in engineering that spent his career in corrections. But as you've said before, you weren't the only one with a kind of a surprising, or what most people would probably think is a surprising degree. Talk a little bit about some of the other kind of backgrounds of people that you worked with and what the benefit of that is.
Yeah. Like there's this one guy I recall who, he was a real rocket scientist.
A real rocket scientist.
He was a real rocket scientist.
We always say rocket scientist, but he actually was one.
He was a real rocket scientist. He worked, that's what he did. And career change in life, and decided he wanted to do something else. There's another guy I know who was a physical therapist. I mean, we just come from all type of backgrounds. There are people who are really, really highly educated, to people who have high school diplomas. But there are just this whole spectrum of people who bring their educational levels and their interests and their talents to the job. And I don't think it's something that anybody starts off aspiring to. For whatever reason, you know, it's an opportunity, and they take a hold of the opportunity. And I know for me and for many others, I am appreciative of the time and this camaraderie that I had in his career in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation.
So 26 years is a long time. So we're going to, in a little bit, we'll talk about some of the things you did that I think are very unique in the second half of your career. But in your career, what are some of the different assignments that you've had in corrections at San Quentin?
And so I tell you, during the first half of my career was much different than the second half of my career. During the first half of my career, I was primarily assigned to death row. I was assigned to death row as an officer, a sergeant, and lieutenant. I was a lieutenant of death row during the last 3 executions that took place at San Quentin. I have experienced what really, really difficult incarceration and confinement experiences, what they're about, what they look like, and the challenges that go along with that. That was, and I'll tell you, I was engaged. I was excited about going to work every day.
I think people might think that's unusual.
I'll tell you. I agree with that, right?
What's wrong with Sam?
But initially, yeah, that's true. But initially, I think you take it in, especially as a supervisor, right? It's about the people who you work with more than the guys who are housed there. Mm-hmm. It's about being in there, being in place, and making sure that you're there when something goes wrong, because you have the talent or you have the insight to be able to lead the troops beyond whatever the drama is of the day. And so I was revved up and ready to go every day to deal with whatever that drama is and to make sure that the people who I cared about, who were the people who were agreeing with me, that they were able to return home to their families like they showed up that day when they showed up at work. That was important to me. And that's how, originally, that's what was really captivating to me about the career. And just the camaraderie you get with these folks who you're really fighting upstream with, or you feel like you're fighting upstream with.
And I imagine there's some unique aspects of working death row in that, some people might not know, but people on death row are usually there for years and years and years. And I would imagine the vast majority of people on death row never actually make it to the actual death part of death row. And so even though they're incarcerated and you're a correctional officer leading a crew that's in charge of their custody and safety and all that, it's got to be some unique situations where you've spent years in many cases probably with these individuals, and then the day that you have to go get them up and get them ready to go to what is going to, or at least that you assume is going to be their death.
Their last day.
So how was that? That's got to be challenging.
And so I'll tell you, death row is unlike anything or any other incarceration experience, especially in the state of California. There are a number of prisons here in the state of California. If a guy has a problem at one facility, you can just transfer him elsewhere, right? Mm-hmm. And he gets this whole different experience. On death row, that's not the case. The guy is there, whether he has issues with the guys who he live amongst or not, whether he has an issue with the staff or not. He's there in that environment for his entire stay. And so definitely there are challenges in navigating that, right? But with that, you have this population that's stagnant that and you grow with, and you evolve as they evolve, and they evolve as you evolve, right? They're there and you're there, and it's just this shared experience from 2 different perspectives. They're on outside the bars, you're outside the bars. And so, you talk about sports, you talk about things in the world. There are people who treat you better than others, right? I remember as a young cop working on death row, there was this old guy who, there was really no reason for him to take a liking to me, but he did. And he's like, copper. He said, come here, I'm gonna show you something. One day, and he took this paper wrapper that looked like it was off of a peppermint wrapper, and he took that and he said, put me in some cuffs. And so he turned around his cell front, and through the food port, I placed him in cuffs, and he took that paper wrapper and he slipped him in the cuffs, and he opened his cuff. He opened his cuffs up.
Wow.
And he said, I'm showing you this He said, because you're escorting these guys around all over the place. And he said, you need to know what's in their hands because there are guys who will know what I know and they will take advantage of it. He said, so watch yourself. And so,
Wow.
and so you get, these just, this amazing camaraderie with some guys. And there's some guys who are really, really challenging. And you just got to deal with that. You deal with that as well. But you're in there with these folks who and you have this experience with that's different than the rest of the world. And you go deal with them and contend with them every day. And so with that, you make it to the end. And it's the guy who you've known for years and he's been respectful to you and all the way up until the end. And it's this day, the death warrant is signed, it's been issued, his final day comes, and you wish him well. You wish him well because you just never know. You never know what happens during the course.
When you say you never know, what do you mean by that?
You never know if he makes it if he goes to the execution facility, whether he's going to come back or not. There are several guys who I had that opportunity to experience them going to the execution facility. They don't come back. The last guy who I wished him well, he came back. The courts intervened during the course of the night, and he came back, and man, that was 2007. So what's that? 18 years later, 15 years, so whatever it is, the guy's still there, and so you just never know.
Yeah, and speaking of that, for myself, 34-year career in law enforcement. Even though the core of me didn't necessarily change, but my perspective of what my job was, my perspective of the criminal justice system or the police department itself, changed over the years. So I'm just curious for you, when you first came in with the intention of not staying, right, just this temporary, make a little bit more money than I'm making at the time, to the time you actually left a few months ago, did your perspective change on what your role as a correctional officer is, what the role of the system is, the role of reentry, all those sort of, did some of those things change? And if so, how and why did they change?
Definitely. I'll tell you, I think, when you begin your career, there is nothing about what I learned in the academy that said that you could have an impact, right? That you were there and you could have any impact on anyone's life. It was that you would go to work, you would make the place secure, keep the place secure, deal with the physical part of it, but then shield yourself from the mental part of it, from the manipulation and just everything that goes along with dealing with the perception of dealing with an incarcerated felon. And so the ideal was you went to work and you made money. And you made the money to take care of your family, and that's what it was about. There's no context outside of that. At the end of my career, I would like to say that I've had an impact. That because Sam Robinson was there, that there are people's lives who were in uniform, who were in the uniform that I wore, who were in the uniform of the incarcerated, who their lives were enriched because I was there, that they had new hope and purpose in life, that they had opportunity that they didn't imagine that they'd ever have in that situation or that circumstance.
So your role was more than just custody and ensuring the safety of the incarcerated and the staff, but a little bit higher level than that.
A little bit higher level than that. Yeah. And it's not anything that's written and your what's called your post orders or your job description or anything like that. It's the ability just to be able to connect with a man and give some of the goodness that you have within them and to have an impact that way. And so, yeah, it has changed. I remember being a cop in our security housing unit at San Quentin, which is where all the bad guys, the worst of the worst in the prison, and for one while you say the worst of the worst in all the California Department of Corrections were at San Quentin in the Adjustment Center. And I remember being the sergeant of the Adjustment Center and looking out the window at volunteers coming into the prison, dealing with our incarcerated, our general population at the facility, and I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how those people were coming in, putting themselves at risk the way that I knew that my staff were putting themselves at risk working with the folks who we were working with. Um, and I'll say I was jaded. I was jaded in that um, I got to a point where I didn't think a man had the ability to be able to evolve or even aspire to do so. But I got out of that. I got out of that housing environment, got out of death row setting, had an opportunity to work more in our general population, and I saw people aspiring to do better than what had led them to prison, and it felt and it seemed like it was really, really genuine, and they interacted with me much differently than what I had previously experienced in my work environment. And man, it enlightened me that man has the capacity to change. Man has the capacity to grow and evolve, no matter what they've done.
Let's talk about that for a little bit. At some point in your career, I think you were a lieutenant, but you were the public information officer or PIO, and there's this newspaper at San Quentin, and you became kind of in charge of that or helping with that program. But what I didn't know is that there's this history behind this newspaper, because now this program at San Quentin is really well known, at least in correction circles, and has a huge distribution and all these things. But what I didn't know is the history of the newspaper at San Quentin. So maybe speak to a little bit of that and what innovative people or a innovative person in the warden and people like you did to revive that newspaper and take it to where it is now.
I'll tell you, there are the San Quentin News. And so
that's what it's called.
That's what it's called, the San Quentin News. And it's not Sam Robinson's publication. It's not the warden's publication at San Quentin State Prison. Really, it's intended to be the voice of the incarcerated man and whatever his thoughts, his desires, whatever he sees in his world from his perspective. And originally it was designed that way. Way back when Warden Duffy began the newspaper. The newspaper began before
When would
him.
that have been?
Warden Duffy is like 1930s, 1940s.
Oh, okay. Long time ago. Okay.
Well, long time ago. Yeah. Thought that there's a way for, there's this undercurrent of, I don't want to say folklore, but the rumor mill inside a prison that's just there. It's kind of into any culture, right? And there's this way for guys inside to be empowered to go to the powers that be to say, hey, what is going on with this situation, right? What's going on with that situation? This is what I see. These are what's in our world that's important. And so the newspaper thrived for years and years on end. And in the mid-'80s, there were pressures from wardens who wanted throughout the country, because there were a number of prison publications all throughout the country. There were
a lot more prevalent back then.
Much more prevalent than they are today, yeah. And they want to censor their publications. And the Supreme Court ruled that they couldn't censor it. And so what administrations could do...
cancel it.
They say, well, we no longer have a prison newspaper.
No need to censor.
That's right. And so prison newspapers in the 1980s kind of went out of business. And with the exception of the Angle Light, and there's one in Minnesota, Angle Light's out of Louisiana, Angola State Prison, and a couple of others, but they just went defunct. Well, my warden, when I began as PIO, my warden began his career at San Quentin in the 1960s, and he knew of the newspaper and how important it was, and he wanted to revive it. And so a year into my tenure as the public information officer, he said, Sam Robinson.
Your job.
He said, I've met these people out and about here in the community of Marin County who are former publishers and newspaper folks, and they're willing to volunteer and come in. We're gonna revive the newspaper, and from that, today we went from this publication that we produced at San Quentin that was really designed just for the guys in San Quentin to being this with maybe a distribution of about 3,000 newspapers to a publication that has over 30,000 newspapers that we send to all the prisons in the state of
Other
California.
prisons, not just San Quentin now,
Not
right?
even San Quentin. Yeah, beyond the walls of San Quentin. And so, yeah, I guess that's one way you have an impact, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned that through all this kind of work in San Quentin, at some point the Discovery Channel came and wanted to do a documentary in the prison. Talk a little bit about what that was and what it led to.
And so I'll tell you, even before the newspaper, my first job as PIO, my handoff as PIO was, hey, there was no training. I went from lieutenant to the spokesperson. And so,
That's how it usually works.
Yeah, that's how and my first day was a Discovery Channel inside of San Quentin. And they had
That was your first day.
That was the first day. They were
Wow.
Discovery Channel inside of San Quentin, and they had been pre-approved by the Department of Corrections to do a documentary series on inmates that they were training to do short documentaries. And so I think they were there for 3-4 months, every day inside the prison, teaching these guys editing skills and how to film and how to capture him, how to put a story together, right? And ultimately, 6 episodes came from that that aired on the Discovery Channel. But what they left us with was they left us with computers. They left the prison with cameras. They left the prison with microphones. They left the prison with software. They left the prison with this infrastructure to develop.
Continue to do this kind of work.
Continue to do this kind of work. The idea was just for that 4 months that these guys would do this, was that we may have the spirit and the initiative to allow more of that to take place. And so I fell into this thing where I had this plethora of resources that Discovery Channel had left us. And then I had a warden who had a vision, who said, hey, Sam, I want to start a newspaper. I want to start a newspaper again. Let's do this. And so being at San Quentin, one of the few metropolitan prisons here in the state of California, the one thing that we had is just this group of folks who had talent from their careers and from their interests, who were willing to just freely raise their hand, volunteer their services with no cost to the taxpayer to come inside and teach folks stuff. And so all we had to do was just partner. All we had to do was say, yeah, we're willing to partner with you, help us out with this. And so I was able to facilitate that. And, I didn't have, I still haven't edited a video to this day.
You make it possible.
But I made it possible. And I was in a place where I could make it possible for the guys inside to do things that were different than what they had been exposed to, whether it's in their childhood, their previous incarceration. It became an aspirational thing for the incarcerated folks inside the prison. Actually, the guy who just interviewed, Jesse will tell you that he went to San Quentin. If you have the conversation with him.
Yes, he did.
He went to San Quentin because he read the San Quentin news.
Yeah.
And he didn't believe the things in the newspaper existed. He wanted to see it himself.
Well, you bring up Jesse, and I imagine he might come up a few other times today, but you said something to me not long ago that surprised me, and I think it would probably shock most people. What is the results of the people that the incarcerated people that worked in the media center in San Quentin and ultimately got released back to our communities, back to my neighborhood, your neighborhood? What is the statistics on those folks that went through this program you talk about, returning to custody after committing another crime?
I know it's unbelievable, man. But zero. None. And I'm not saying that this is the panacea, right? That you teach a guy how to film.
Pretty impressive, though.
You teach a guy how to get in front of a microphone and put together this story. That's the fix-all to incarceration. Right. I am not going to say
that's
that.
That's probably not for everybody that's in custody either.
That's right?
Yeah.
But for the guys who raise their hand, the guys who say, this interests me. The guys who are willing to work at it, right? The guys who are willing to contribute that way, it's had this profound impact on them. And whether they continue it outside or not, and some of them have. Some of them have started their own production companies. Some of them are engaged in many other ways. But you have this new skill set, and you have this ownership that you built in a place where really the only ownership you have is what comes in
Right.
six 1 cubic boxes, right? Which is the stuff that you own inside your cell. And there's this whole different responsibility that you have, that you can have an impact on the world beyond you. And it's worked. Those guys haven't come back to prison. And so it has been just like this. I think President Bush had the 1,000 points of light. It's been one of those points. It's been a beacon of light.
So with that being said, there is still a significant number of people in society in general that would probably say, don't do programs like that, because you commit some of these horrible crimes in society. You need to just go and be in custody, bust rocks or something. And, you know, you don't have to look too far to see somebody that used to be in custody that is now out in the community that commits a horrible crime, kill somebody. We've had a murder or two here in Sacramento where it's somebody that was a parolee at large. So what would you, somebody that has experience with this program, gave the statistic that you just gave, 0 recidivism of this program, say to the people that say, why are we wasting our time and our money, because we're paying you to help run this program as a captain. We shouldn't be doing that. And we shouldn't be providing education and all these things that I have to pay for out of my pocket. You committed a crime. You just go do your time. And matter of fact, I don't care that you ever come back into society. What do you, with somebody with your experience, what do you say to people that, you know, for probably some legitimate things that they see happening in the community, feel that way?
I'll tell you, I may have been one of those people, right?
Right.
And so I definitely resonate with that. But I have this insight because I was there and I experienced this thing and I saw it and I've seen it and I see how it works. And that is that most people don't know that the way the sentencing guidelines and sentencing structure work here in the state is that 90% of the people who are incarcerated for a crime and are sent to prison, they're coming home. They're coming back to you. So how do you want them to come? Do you want this guy that's been in a box, who's sat on the yard playing dominoes all day, who sat in a circle with his homeboys and have just refined a new way of how to do what they did the first time in prison, to do it again when they get out? Or do you want this guy who's had the opportunity to go and to learn some new insight and see the world differently than what he experienced before? And I'll tell you, those guys who there's different prison worlds. There are guys who do exactly that. They go to prison, they sit on the yard, they play dominoes, they are in their cohort with their homeboys, and they are just waiting to pounce on society again, right? But there are other guys who take advantage of the opportunities that are available, whether it's vocational trades, whether it's someone sitting in learning about how their childhood was jacked up and it influenced how they think, and what led them to their crime, and how that impacted other people. The latter guy is the guy who returns to the society, for the most part, who does not recidivate. It's the guy who sits on the front end, who's on that front end, who is on a yard with no opportunity. And that's no opportunity is essentially the same thing as being in prison, breaking rocks.
Right.
Prison is hard. The guy that's walking around in the mix and stabbing other folks, that's the breaking rocks. And that guy comes out to society and he takes all of that back out, and he's no different. But
Sounds to me like what you're saying is that people are different, right? Some guys don't respond to the programs you talked about. Some people do.
Some people do.
Some people so it's not all one person in prison. These human beings that have different needs, different reasons how they got there, all those sort of things.
Exactly. And opportunity. Sometimes it's opportunity. The place that I worked at for 26 years is a place that's in the metropolitan area and had just a lot of opportunity for folks. And so if you made it to San Quentin and you didn't take advantage of the opportunity, you were just a guy who decided you wanted to be a knucklehead.
Right.
But there's so many
he was there.
because he was there, because all the opportunity was there. And for those folks who take advantage of the opportunity, the media center, 0% recidivism rate. We had this college program at San Quentin. It's now rebranded to called Mount Tam. It's a prison. It's a college program that only operates inside the prison at San Quentin, and their recidivism rate was 10%.
That's much lower than average, also.
And then overall average as well, because there are people who go and they work hard and they learn and they see the world differently than what got them there in the first place. That's the guy who you want to return to the community.
And speaking of, you said perspectives and things like that, you went through a program, I think it was called the Amend Project. And actually, I don't know if it's part of that specific program or not, but actually had an opportunity to go to Norway and look at the correctional system. And you were part of this cohort from all over the country. Talk a little bit about what you saw in Norway in their prisons or institutions that is different from what you saw in your own prison or other prisons around California and the country.
Well, I'll tell you, the Men Project, it's out of the University of San Francisco, or University of California at San Francisco. It's a group that's focused on how to reimagine incarceration in the U.S. And their ideal is that the outcomes are not optimal on both sides for the people who work there and for the people who live there.
So for the correctional officers and the incarcerated people.
Exactly. If you look at the statistics, correctional officers, they don't live very long after they retire. And they have, their health issues and all that type of stuff from dealing with it in this high charged environment, right? And same thing on the opposite end. Like you say, the guys who are in prison, they're on a yard, and they're just dealing with drama all the time. They bring that, whether it comes back to the community or whether, it impacts them inside themselves, not good outcomes as well. And so men have said, hey, let's figure out how to do things different and what the best practices are. And so they've partnered with Norway, who 30 years ago had many of the same outcomes that we have here in the States with their staff and with the incarcerated population. And Norway put together a bunch of experts who developed what they call, and they're proud of it too, they call it the white paper. And the white paper are these documents that reimagines what prison looks like, and from the incarcerated perspective and from the people who work there. And so, like I shared with you earlier, when I began my career in the California Department of Corrections, it was about making sure the place was secure, counting the guys, counting the equipment. We got to keep them in. Don't share too much about yourself. I mean, hey, if the guy know you have a boat that you fish, he's gonna use that, and next thing you know, you're gonna be crossed up. You're gonna lose your job.
Wait till we get to the end of this podcast and people hear how the relationship you have now with people that were incarcerated. But go ahead.
Yeah, tell me about it.
You done shared way too much now.
I probably did. But then it's like you don't have any type of outside, other than your job, don't have any type of perspective or relationship with the guys, because they're going to use it to manipulate you, right? And in Norway, they began their process of teaching their correctional officers what their experience is, which is their ideal is that, hey, the guy who is coming to prison, he's coming to prison because he hasn't had the opportunity to meet people like you. And because he hasn't had the opportunity to meet people like you, he's ended up in prison. And so we want you to expose yourself to the guy professionally, right?
So more than just custody.
More than just custody. Yeah. We want you to develop a relationship with the guy. We want you to mentor the guy, right? We want you to mentor the guy because we believe by the guy having access to you, that he'll leave and he'll be a better guy. And so they believe that, the day a guy enters prison is the day that we work toward restoring him to the community. and making sure things are as normal in prison, in the prison experience, as they are to the world. So it's transition between the two.
And what are some examples of that? Making things normal. What do you mean by making things normal in the prison? Because I'm sorry, I don't want to go to prison because I don't think there's anything normal in there. So what do you mean by that?
And so I tell you, man, in California, if a guy goes to the store, what we call the canteen, right? If he goes to the store, he goes up to this window, and it probably has inch-thick glass. It has like these little slots in it, and a little place where, you know, the items that he buy in the store, he never touches it until it gets outside the window.
Until they slide it under the glass.
Until they slide under glass to him, right? He never walks through the store. He just has this list, and he's picking from the list. When I went to Norway, it was like when I went to their store, there was no thick glass. It was like I stepped into 7-Eleven.
Like a regular store.
It was a regular store.
Like you walk in.
There were things on the shelf that you could touch, you could feel. There were refrigerators where guys could buy meat. It was a store. I bought stuff. I bought candy at the store that I brought home to my family.
You bought stuff at the same spot that the incarcerated guys.
Yeah, the incarcerated people buy stuff at, and so with my correctional experience here in California, I was like, hey, look, I say, what about theft? I said, you guys have to say, these guys are incarcerated.
Right, they're gonna steal the whole store.
I said, do you have a problem with that? They say, yeah, it happens. And
also happens in the regular 7-Eleven.
It happens in regular 7-Eleven. and then he turned it back on me. He said, hey, the way you do it, does it happen with the way you do it? It's like, yeah, we lose stuff. Because people can hustle, right? He said, but the ideal is we want the guy to come in here. He's working inside. He has a job. We want him to come in here and utilize the resources that he's earned to purchase the things that he needs, just like he would in the community. So when he leaves, it's no different. The experience is no different. There is no shock.
He doesn't have the anxiety that we hear from so many people that have done significant time in prison, have anxiety just doing regular everyday things once they get out.
Exactly. Going to the store, you know, for many of the guys I've heard on the back end of their incarceration is an experience.
Yeah. Yeah. So this program, the Media Center that you were so intimately involved in, that has zero recidivism, has like a podcast called Ear Hustle. And now you just recently retired, but for some reason you can't get enough. So you were talking about, you know, maybe almost being busier in retirement than you were when you were working for the state. So before I get to the last couple questions I have, you know, I think people would be surprised. And I admit, I think I was probably a little surprised too. And I know I grew up with, I think probably similar to you, a lot of my friends ended up going to prison, but they're all in their 50s now. So if they're still alive, they're out now. And I just had this perspective of them as, you know, they were just like me when we were kids. So I never have looked at them as necessarily like inmates and incarcerated, because I knew them before they ever went, and they weren't any worse than I was.
Exactly.
Right? We all did stupid stuff, stole a few things here and there.
Exactly.
But eventually they progressed to something that got them years in prison. But I think it is, unfortunately, probably in some cases, unusual that we had Jesse on the A Way Forward podcast, who was sentenced to 3 life terms in prison, and now is out and he's a graduate. He's one of those 0% that you talked about.
Yeah.
But he's doing amazing things out in the community. But you have a relationship with him. A correctional officer captain has a relationship with a guy that had 3 life terms, and I know he's not the only one that was in custody. How is that even possible? I think most people would be extremely surprised about that. And I think there's a lot of people, I know there's officers that when I came on were the OGs, would have told me and would tell you probably to this day, that's the dumbest thing you can do. Don't you ever have a relationship. You kind of mentioned it earlier. Don't you ever have a relationship with these cats. They'll turn on you. They're criminals. There's no hope. They are who they are. And yet here you are with guys like Jesse and many others. How is that possible, and why is that?
Man, that's a good question. I'll tell you, man. I think you treat people like you want to be treated, right? If a guy has worked on himself, if a guy has changed who he is, who he was, that you wouldn't have had a relationship with because he's on the opposite side of the fence that your values are different, and his values have changed, and you become more in alignment with each other. Then why are you gonna put up a roadblock to a relationship that may be beneficial, mutually beneficial to both? And I guess, if you talk to Jesse, I would assume that he'd say that I may have been his mentor at one time. I think that mentorship never ends. And so how do you just cut it off just because a guy
Well, he even said he went to a baseball game with the warden.
Oh, yeah, he did.
Like, I think my younger self, what's wrong with that warden? You're not supposed to be hanging out. There's got to be a rule against that or something.
What rule? I'm still looking for it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but again, because of culturally how you begin your career and what the standards were, you're like, no, that's unacceptable. That's
Right.
overfamiliar. That's you have to be compromising somewhere. You're not being a professional. And no, you are being a professional.
I think that's leadership too.
It is leadership.
That's your leadership as a captain, making it okay for the guys that worked on your team to be able to work and mentor people in custody. Same with the warden that's going to the baseball game, or the warden that brought back the newspaper, right? I'm sure that wasn't 100% on board with all the people that worked in corrections, whether at San Quentin and outside, at the district office, at the headquarters and all that, right?
Exactly.
So he probably had some challenges to overcome, but that's leadership. And now we can see the fruits of your leadership, of the warden's leadership, and probably countless others, including people like Jesse that were incarcerated, that now it leads to programs that have zero recidivism, better lives, both of the people that were in custody, of the correctional officers. But what I heard you just say a little bit ago is you mentioned something about those that have changed, or those that have evolved, those that have grown while they were in custody, which tells me, just in case anybody's wondering, that there are people in custody that you would not have a relationship
Oh, yeah.
out of custody, right? It's not like you're going around, I'm hugging everybody, everybody's awesome. There are people that you would not have that same relationship.
There are bad people who places like San Quentin are designed for, they're built for, and they're built to incarcerate them for as long as they are that way.
So this ain't some fantasy land you're living
No,
in.
no,
This is reality.
This
there
is
are
reality.
some people that, okay.
There are people who should be locked away forever and need to be locked away forever. And there's some of those people who get out. But again, there are people who work really, really hard they saw the error of their ways. They learned something different. They aspired for something different innately within themselves. And places like San Quentin have given them an opportunity to develop change within their lives, within themselves. And there are guys who are walking among the streets all day long, every day, like Jesse, like some of the others who you've mentioned and have spoken with before my interview today, who are different people than they were when they committed their crime on the street. They were different people than they were when they first entered the walls of a prison, and they evolved. I think that over the course of my 26-year career, I evolved.
I was going to say,
Robinson
you've
today.
just described when we first started talking, you're a different person
I'm
than
a
when you
different
first
person.
started at corrections.
Yeah.
Like, we all evolve.
Exactly.
So, Sam, now after you retired, you're not having to go inside San Quentin every day and do some of those things, but now you're working on something called Media in a Box, I think is what you called it. Talk a little bit about what that is and what you're trying to do with that program to further what you've been working on.
And so I'll tell you, as part of the MEN project that I mentioned before, they had a project for us. And one of our homework assignments was to figure out a way that, you could have an impact within your facility, right? Mm-hmm. And when I was assigned, I was like, all right, I think I've already done that. I have this media center at San Quentin. Right. I have a podcast that's been downloaded over 70 million times.
Which is called?
Ear Hustle.
Okay.
I have this newspaper that's award-winning and ends up in every prison in the state of California. And it's across the nation. It ends up in facilities across the nation. We get people writing to prison from Florida and every state in the U.S. saying, hey, I read this in the San Quentin newspaper, because it's out there, right? It's something that people who are interested in incarceration, that they have in their hands. We have these video projects that one's called Forward This, and a few others, that San Quentin TV, that we capture these stories from inside the walls of San Quentin. And it's with the guys themselves. And so I said, okay, I have this thing. How do I make sure it's sustainable beyond Sam Robinson? Because it all developed under Sam Robinson. How do I make sure that at the end of my career, that when I leave, that it's able to carry forward beyond that? And so that was my project. And so I came up with this idea called Media Center in a Box, which is, my original idea was to make it sustainable inside the prison. But as I was developing, I said, no one who has been through the Media Center has returned to prison. And so if since that's the case, then how do you make this replicable elsewhere? And so it's how you take this box, or an aspect that we have in the box, and place it in a prison in Central California, place it in a prison in Kansas, place it in Texas or anywhere else in this nation, an aspect of it, to give people what the people at San Quentin have experienced, and hopefully with similar outcomes, that, they develop themselves, have this ownership, and are able to return to their communities with this different perspective and a different heart, and be a different man or woman than they were, that led them to incarceration. And so Media Center in a Box became this project that I presented during my amend stay.
Your amend dissertation?
My amend dissertation, that's right. And then I brought it back to San Quentin to start working on it. And as we worked on it, Jesse, who, like you say, this guy who was sentenced to 3 life sentences.
I think he's like the executive director of Friends of San Quentin now, right? Jesse is the guy that had 3 life sentences.
The guy who had 3 life sentences, who was the editor-in-chief of the San Quentin News while he was incarcerated. He's outside, and he is the guy who fundraises for to support the operation of the newspaper and the media center. And so I partnered with Jesse and said, hey, Jesse, I have this idea. And Jesse has operationalized the ideal. And through his efforts, Media Center in a Box expanded to Folsom Women's Facility. There's a women's facility at Folsom State Prison that we expanded to, in conversations to expand in other prisons here in the state of California, and a couple throughout the country. And so it's this ideal that maybe there is something to this 0%. Let's see if it's replicated elsewhere. And not only that, give people the opportunity to have a voice and to share their experience. And that's empowering. I think it's empowering sitting here with you today, right? It's empowering to be able to share the perspective with people who would never heard Sam Robinson and his perspective of being this prison guard. And I'll use prison guard as a correction. And the results, right? This prison guard on death row, and what it's like at the end of my career, and the perspective I have from that.
So with that in mind, anyone listening to this podcast that is inspired by what you've just described, and the Media Center, Media in a Box, all these things that have literally had a positive impact, not only inside the institution, but with zero recidivism, that means it's had a positive impact on our communities. How would they get involved to help what you just described, expand this and open these opportunities to other people that in theory you would assume would have similar impacts on? How would somebody listening to this podcast contribute to whatever you need, whatever Jesse needs to expand this?
And so the primary way is you can go to www.sanquentinnews.com and click on the website. And on the website, There are a couple different buttons. There's a donation button. And so if that's the way you feel like you can contribute, you can donate and receive a newspaper yourself, or send it to someone that you know that may be incarcerated, and enlighten them on opportunities that are available to them and what incarceration can be and how different it can be, right? And it resonates with their perspective. Also, there's a comments section or a share button on there as well, that you can leave your comments and how you may have some interests or some talents, or some connections on how
To directly get involved.
involved.
Okay.
That's right. And you can say, hey, Sam Robinson sent me here. Jesse, come find me. Leave your contact information, and definitely we're very, very responsive. We'll get back to you. And the ideal is just having better outcomes for the people who are incarcerated. And what that leads to is better outcomes for the people who've never experienced incarceration, because you don't end up with a situation where you're a victim of crime. That's what the ideal is.
And you mentioned Jesse does some fundraising to help support the program. Is there a place on there if somebody, maybe didn't have the time but was very inspired by what you said today? Is there a place where somebody could financially donate to the project program also?
Yes, yes. On the donation button, it has an option for you can donate as much as your heart desires, and so definitely, their financial resources are important. But again, however you can contribute, it is important, because I know, not only that I know that it's impactful and has had an impact on people's lives. It has, and it continues to do today.
Well, thank you. And, early on in this podcast, you had mentioned the life expectancy of correctional officers and the life expectancy of people in custody, which wasn't very long after they left either custody or in custody, and after the correctional officers retired. And it's the same way with police officers outside of the institutions, like 3.5 years or something. It's some ridiculously low number.
I mean, during your career, just think about it. How many of those folks, they don't make it to the first check, to the first retirement check.
No,
they
you
retire.
hear it all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what you've just described is, and you mentioned this is kind of what they're doing in Norway, but what you just described, what I've just witnessed in this podcast is a Sam Robinson who got a lot more fulfillment out of his career than just a check. And I think a lot more feeling of worth and contributing. And the similar could be said about the incarcerated people that are in these programs. So I think what you've done in your career has not only surely saved lives, both in custody and in our communities, but I think it's provided hope and a sense of worth to not only incarcerated people, but correctional officers, which I can't help but to think that lowers stress and prolongs people's lives. So thank you for your career and how you went about it, and your evolution and what you've done for the correctional system and our communities in the state. I always congratulate people that have a lengthy career in law enforcement, because it's not an easy career, but you have truly made a difference. And as we've talked about, what you've done continues and hopefully will continue to evolve and grow. So thank you for everything you've done for my family, for our society, for corrections. Your engineering degree went to good use in the correctional system. It might not built any buildings or dams or bridges, but it definitely built human beings. So thank you for everything you've done, and congratulations on your retirement.
Thank you for that. It's funny to me that you mentioned that, man. When I retired at the end of the year, I had a retirement party at the end of January. And, you get perspective about things, right? And I was talking to my mom, and my mom was saying, she said, I was so angry at you.
I bet she was.
She said, I was so disappointed, so angry at you when you decided to do that. But she said, you just never know. She said, on the back end of your career, she said, this thing has been extraordinary. And she said, I'm so proud of you. And
That's pretty awesome.
And so that's what it's about.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Well, thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
One of the big purposes of A Way Forward is to hear different voices and different opinions, because that is how we can make informed decisions ourselves. So if you are someone that would like to come on A Way Forward to express your opinion, go to chiefhahn.com/podcast. Chief, HAHN.com/podcast.